Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your hosts, Chris Jennings and Dr. Mike Brazier.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I am joined here today by my co-host, Chris Jennings. And today we have another exciting episode for you. It's going to be a highly educational episode. We're going to pay tribute in some way to the hunters and the active role that they play in collecting data that through the years has provided the foundation for much of what we know about waterfowl population ecology. And quite frankly, it continues to fuel many of the decisions around waterfowl management and conservation in North America. And so specifically, we're going to be talking about waterfowl hunters as citizen scientists and the important role that we all play in that regard. To help us in this discussion, we're going to be welcoming in a special guest, Dr. Mark Lindberg, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Institute of Arctic Biology. Mark, welcome into the show, and I promise that'll be the last time I refer to you as Dr. Lindberg per our earlier conversation.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us here. We always want to start off the show when we have some special guests by giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself, your personal insights, professional interest, and kind of where you are today, and help us understand a little bit about where you come from.
Yeah, sure. I think it's very important when talking to hunters that first establish that many of us are also hunters too, that are also biologists. And sure enough, I started hunting when I was 10. I grew up in Pennsylvania. My dad was a big-time deer hunter, and he encouraged me, and I got interested very early in life. And that interest just continued to grow through my life. And my roots, again, were in deer hunting, but my passion is definitely in upland bird hunting, and I do a fair amount of waterfowl hunting as well. So hopefully hunters appreciate as I'm talking to them that I could appreciate their perspective and have a similar one as they do. That interest in hunting and wildlife and outdoors grew into a career as well. I started with the Pennsylvania Game Commission in 1984 as a technician. I was working on a project on Canada geese, and that led into some graduate studies. Did my master's degree on Canada geese at Cornell University in the late 1980s, and that led to a PhD in Alaska on black brant. From there, I started down my career path. I actually had a job at Ducks Unlimited, and in 2001, we returned to Alaska, and I took a position, as you described, as a faculty member, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I've been ever since.
I always try to do a little bit of research, additional research on the guests that we're going to have, and so I went to your webpage, and you're an incredibly accomplished waterfowl ecologist. When I read your bio, your research interest, you're interested in things such as population ecology, banding analyses, harvest management, decision analysis. You're one of those smart people that I always look up to. You bring a lot of quantitative skills to these discussions, and that's always really valuable. It's sometimes intimidating for me to get in these conversations, but I think you're going to be a fantastic part of this show. So happy to have you on this, and appreciate your time, because I know you're certainly a busy person.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, you're right about traveling around for this job. Early in my career, someone pointed out to me, hey, if you study waterfowl, they can take you to some really neat places. And I just like to point out that has definitely been the case, and one of the reasons I initially got interested.
And Mark, you also have, I believe, a podcast of your own that you started here recently, something I believe it's called the Hunting Science Podcast. Do I have that right?
Yeah, thanks for the plug, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I have been very active and I guess successful in science in the form of communicating to other scientists. But one of the things I was frustrated with, I guess, late in my career is that we weren't getting this science to hunters enough, at least, in my opinion. And that was the motivation behind starting this podcast, as you said, called Hunting Science. And our goal is to make hunters aware of the science of hunting. And there's quite a bit of it. Some we'll talk about today, but there's other podcasts there that dive into other topics as well.
We talk about that often, Chris and Clay and I, when we're kind of mapping out the potential for this particular podcast. And there is so much really interesting information that feeds the waterfowl management enterprise. And I know a lot of our hunters and conservation supporters will be interested in that. And I think your philosophy on the hunting podcast, the Hunting Science podcast of yours, is sort of similar to ours. The more that we can educate and share this information with our supporters, I think the greater appreciation and understanding of that resource they have. And so that's pretty cool that you've headed down that road.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. I'm going to have to look into that, into your podcast. Just when this topic came up, I thought, kind of the citizen science is how waterfowl hunters kind of lead the way with this. One thing to kind of expand on, even from what Mike said, is I live every day inside the waterfowl hunting community, working with the magazine, creating content online, social media. But every time we do one of these podcasts, I manage to pick up some tidbit of information from the science side of things, something that I didn't know. Something that I know that our listeners will definitely learn from. So I do appreciate you coming on, and this is going to be a great topic, the citizen scientist.
Thanks. Yeah.
So to that topic, let's get right into it here. When we use the term citizen scientist, I think that term has probably come of age in the last 10 years. At least that's my sense of it. Mark, help us understand what we're actually talking about when we use that term.
Yeah, I think you're right. That term is relatively new, but the idea of someone collecting information for us, data, scientific data for us, is rather old. And that is my definition, someone who volunteers to collect information to help us make management decisions, conservation decisions. And I guess I would add to that definition that they may not know they're doing that. So it's either knowingly or unknowingly, they're helping us gather information that we need to make the best decisions we possibly can.
Whenever I was thinking about this episode over the past few days, and in my mind coming up with examples of citizen scientists, I think we're going to mention that waterfowl hunters and hunters in general are some of the first citizen scientists that we've ever had. But there's also another group of citizen scientists out there that I don't know how common or how active they are anymore. But when I was growing up, my grandfather would be one of these local weather reporters. The local weather station would reach out to these to citizens in towns around the broadcast location. And I got a great kick out of having my granddad be the one to call in and report the weather from his little town. And so the fact that I have a grandfather that collected data and reported it is probably going to come as a shock and surprise to no one that knows me, and the fact that I'm into data a little bit. So that was sort of a neat way of looking back, and a personal example that I thought about. Mark, what are some other specific examples of citizen science as we might see in the conservation field?
Yeah, your point about the weather data is a good one. I hadn't even thought about that. But yeah, hunters have been doing this for quite some time. I guess maybe the most obvious way to some hunters they do this is through things like a bag check station. You stop, you show who's ever checking what you may have harvested, and they might look at the age, the sex of the animal, or some other characteristics. So that's citizen scientist data that you're providing to help them make management decisions about those animals. I know this is the case most other places, but in Alaska, every year after a season closes, we need to file hunt reports, whether we harvested an animal or not. Where did we hunt? How many days did we hunt? How did we get to where we hunted? Things like that. And it again helps them, agencies, make management decisions for those species. And there's more modern forms starting to crop up here and there too. EBird is one app that you can get on your phone that allows you to report observations of birds from around the world that's shared with biologists and scientists and other birders and hunters for that matter. So there's definitely a lot of forms in which hunters, citizens can contribute.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
I know hunters, maybe someone forgets their license and they have to call in. And I've actually been on the phone, with people or been near them when, they're filling out their license online and telling, or it's an automated system and they're just pressing no. And, and I'm like, hey man, you can't do that, and they're like, why? I'm just trying to get through it. And I'm like, because it's an important, it's an important aspect. It's something, HIP is something that every single hunter in the U.S. is participating in now. And that's one great program and something for people to keep in mind when they start getting the questions about, did you hunt coots, rails, or gallinules, and then, just make sure you're following along with that. And that's a good reminder for hunters that they are participating in this science.
Yeah, definitely. The Harvest Information Program is a very obvious one. About 1 million waterfowl hunters a year are reporting their harvest from the previous year. That's 1 million data points provided by citizen scientists. And that information goes into decisions about future harvest regulations. So it's important not only to provide that information, but do it in a reliable manner.
I would imagine as some people are listening to this, they're expecting us to get into the details of what the Harvest Information Program is and how that data is used. Because there's a tremendous misunderstanding of how that data is used. A lot of people think that it's estimating a harvest for the current year, but that's not true at all. So I don't want to veer off into that. Otherwise, we'll have to be pulled out of the ditch here on this particular podcast. But we will get back to that at some point in the future. What are some other examples, Mark, of citizen science data collection responsibilities that waterfowl hunters have?
Yeah, so some hunters, not all, participate in what is called, not attractively, the parts collection survey, maybe a better name, the wing survey. That's been going on for about 40 years. And here hunters send in their wings of harvested waterfowl, and biologists gather every year at what's called the wing bee. And at that wing bee, they look at those wings, and from the patterns of feathers and colors, they can tell the age and the sex of the birds. And by knowing the age and sex, they can determine things like production rates for that year. So if there's more young birds in the wing bees than adult birds, that looks like a good production year, whereas the reverse might indicate that it wasn't a very good production year. So that's a neat way to do it. And it's really fun to look at those wings. One of my first jobs was to work bag check stations looking at wings of birds that hunters had harvested. And it's pretty fascinating that you can determine that much information just from the color patterns in the wings. The other one that people might be a little more familiar with is reporting the bands of lake-banded birds they may harvest. So those who have been around for a while know that the metal lake bands on waterfowl used to have just something simple that said, advise Washington, D.C., and not many people knew what to do with those bands. In fact, about 35% of the people reported those bands when that information existed. But in more recent decades, we've moved to a phone reporting system with 800 numbers. And also now we're using websites to allow hunters to report information on the birds they've harvested, banded birds they've harvested. And that results in about 100,000 reports per year. And about 75% of the hunters that get a band now report that information. So we've increased the volume of data.
I'm just curious, did the when the submitting process went online and did you guys see like a slight jump in the percentage of birds reported? I mean, just the convenience of it, especially this day and age. Even when you're hunting, you're not without your phone. Did you see any increase in that go up just because it makes it so easy?
Yeah, it was almost immediate increase. In fact, shortly after they implemented the 1-800 number that doesn't exist anymore, but when they implemented, I so happened to be at the bird banding lab in Washington, D.C., and they had a bank of phones there that were people were answering. And while I was there during the hunting season, people were calling in from their blind. Hey, I just shot this pintail with this number, and it was an immediate input of information, and then they got immediate feedback on that bird as well. Expenses of having people answer those phones were probably the most important reason why they decided to just go to a more passive approach of having people entered on the website. But nonetheless, it's still a system that encourages people to hunt it, or report, I should say. And again, reporting rates back in the day when this goes back to 1920s, by the way, when we just had advised Washington, D.C., about 35% of the people actually reported it, and now about 75% do. So that's been a huge improvement in the information we get from those, and is consistent, I guess, with sort of my philosophy is we should empower hunters with knowledge that will make them better citizen scientists. And I think that case study is a good example of where we see those improvements in the information. Just another statistic that I like to throw out, but since 1960, hunters have reported almost 4 million bands.
Wow, that's impressive. Now, you mentioned the 20, so in that data set, it's assumed that 25% of the people who shoot a banded bird do not report it. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's determined through things like reward band studies. I don't know if anybody has had been fortunate enough to shoot a bird that has a monetary value on its band, but the idea there is that occasionally we put those type of bands out, and the assumption is that at some dollar value, whatever that is, everyone that shoots it, a bird with that dollar value, will report it. And from there, we can estimate how many report it when there is no dollar value. So that's how we've determined how reporting rates, which they're called, have changed through time. But yeah, there's still some 25% of the people that choose not to report those bands based on the information we have.
Are those reporting rates calculated every year?
No, it's not done every year, and it's done occasionally as needed, is how I would say it. I don't think anything's been done for a few years now.
But certainly, when there's a change in reporting method, that's when it becomes really important.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And I think we're just starting to go down this path, if you will, of empowering hunters with this type of knowledge. I'm kind of curious if we get the word out via podcasts or other ways. I wonder if reporting rates will increase. People, again, my guess is that some of that 25% of the people that don't report just don't understand the value of that information. And that if we can tell them...
They don't understand how it's right.
Yeah. So, it just leads to better decisions. It's more reliable information. The more information we have, the more reliable it is. So not reporting that information creates uncertainty in the decisions we make. And again, I think I'm of the opinion that if hunters understood that, more of them would report their bands, because I think almost everyone wants us to have reliable information.
I want to go back just a little bit. You mentioned something about the 1-800 bands. I know those bands are no longer used, but if someone recovers a bird that has a 1-800 band on it, is that number still functional?
The number, I believe, just gets you to a recording that tells you to report it via the website. I'm pretty sure that's where it goes now. No, so it's not functional in the sense you can't report your information via that route, but it tells you how to do it.
But you can still report those 1-800 bands online.
Yeah, you can still do that online for sure. Have you shot one?
It's been a while. I think I did. I think I shot one of the early ones. That would have been back when the number was functional.
Yeah. I shot a band one time in Indiana when I was younger and got excited, picked it up. I was like, yeah, my first band. I was probably 16, 17 years old and looked at the band, and it had some guy's name. I won't mention his name just in case he's still around, but had his name carved in it very loosely with a phone number, and I called it, and I'm sure he was some knucklehead in Brazil, Indiana that was banding birds, probably illegally without a permit. That's the only duck band I've ever killed. So
we'll have to get into our banding stories.
Absolutely.
The birds we've shot with banded birds. I actually I have a couple of interesting stories on that. I hope we've shared with our listeners their role in collecting this information. I think we're going to have you back and talk a little bit more about how some of this data is used, and speak a little bit more deliberately about the importance of reporting the data reliably and collecting that data reliably. And we want folks to realize that they play a critical role. They have for decades, and they will continue to play a critical role in the data that is collected and used to manage our waterfowl harvest on an annual basis. And we want to share this information with people. We want them to understand how that information is used. We want them to understand the importance of it. And we appreciate you coming on and helping us tell this story. I think, Chris, any final words here?
Everyone out there listening, report your bands.
Report your bands, absolutely.
It's important.
Mark, any final words on this this particular episode?
Just this thought, I guess. The way I try to present this to hunters, if you were the decision maker, if the hunter was the person setting the harvest regulations, what information would you like to have to do that? And I think everyone would say the most reliable information I can get. And I think if you view it from that perspective, then that will really motivate you to want to provide this information in a reliable manner. So hopefully people will think that way about it. It's not like we're trying to use this information against you. It's everyone involved wants to make the best decisions possible, and that's only possible with reliable data.
That's right. Mark, we again thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us all the way from Fairbanks, and I'll thank my co-host Chris Jennings for joining us here. I want to also thank at this time our producer Clay Baird, who's going to make us all sound great. And thanks to each of our listeners, for a very important part of this entire enterprise. Thank you for your contribution to the science. Thank you for your commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation. And we'll catch you on the next episode.
Report your band.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.